Hey, thanks for joining me. Um, if you've clicked on this video, you're probably already aware of the case. If you're not, I'll just briefly provide some context. There's been a high-profile legal case here in the UK, which involved a young woman, Oxford University student, who stabbed her boyfriend following a row. The stabbing wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough to cause him some injury, and he has suffered from anxiety and depression. Well, when it appeared before court, it's just been ruled that her sentence was suspended. She did not face a custodial sentence, and there's been a larger than normal amount of scrutiny on the judge involved in this, Judge Pringle, because of his rationale in suspending her sentence. And his rationale was that because she is studying to be a surgeon, I believe, um, that because she was a bright mind and because she would be more beneficial to society, in his opinion, he did not want to give her a suspended sentence. He also went on to effectively praise her, and yeah, basically, his rationale for that, particularly this aspect about smart, did not go down too well with the wider public and in the press. And it basically ended up on the headlines of the newspapers as student too smart for jail. Now, before I continue, I want to say if I get any particular details of this wrong, I'll be very happy to stand corrected if anyone is involved in the case or if anyone notices that I make any obvious mistake. That's not intentional. But like a lot of people, I've been following this very closely, and my feelings on it is that Judge Pringle is should be struck off. I think his rationale is totally absurd and, frankly, a little bit sinister. And the reason I say sinister is because if the logic is that people can be too smart to go to jail, then you're essentially saying that a smart person could get away with anything. This wasn't a trivial offence. This was a serious assault. And it is lucky the injury wasn't more serious, but the intent was obviously there. I take the view that someone who is prepared to put a knife into someone is potentially a dangerous person. That is not something you do without wanting some malicious intent. And it goes without saying that do you really want a person who has a conviction with a lethal weapon being involved around sharp instruments? I mean, what if one of her patients in the future, winds her up? Is she going to stab them? I remember someone wrote into one of the newspapers saying, as a doctor, I speak for many by saying we do not want this person in our profession. So the case has caused a lot of controversy and quite a lot of anger. And I can understand that because I really do think there is sinister overtones there that if you're smart, you get spared a custodial sentence. If you're stupid, you go to jail. Now, Judge Pringle didn't say that, but that is the implication of what he's saying. That somehow, if you're useful to society, if you happen to be skilled in a certain area, you should be spared jail. To me, that rationale is perverse. Some of the, and obviously this is an extension of the offence that we're talking about here, but some of the most serious criminals in history have also been extremely clever people. Look at Ted Bundy. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but he was a very smart guy. You get many serial killers, indeed terrorists, who are very bright people. So, under this logic that they might be good in another field, so we should spare them prison, I think that is totally perverse. To me, it's a survival of the fittest logic, and it's totally plain wrong. It reminds me of the case in Chicago in the 20s. Um, Nathaniel Loeb and I think that they were called the Loeb brothers. I forget exactly, but basically, I'll see if I can type this in whilst I'm discussing it. That case involved two young, let's say, um, rich kids who basically murdered a fellow student. Um, and their rationale behind it was, yeah, Leopold and Loeb. Um, this was back in the 20s. They set about kidnapping. Um, Nathan Leopold Jr. and Richard Albert Loeb, known as the Leopold and Loeb case. They were two wealthy students at the University of Chicago who, in May 1924, kidnapped and murdered a 14-year-old boy solely to test their wits against the police. One of them ended up dying in prison. Another, I think, spent a lengthy custodial sentence. I think Illinois, the time they were sentenced, didn't have the death penalty. It was something like that. Anyway, the point is that was a classic example of two criminals who had very high intelligence. Now, in that case, they actually were sentenced. But, what's to say they couldn't have been really prestigious students and brought their intelligence to something really benevolent to society? So I just don't buy this argument that Judge Pringle is using. And I think it really brings into question his credibility. There has been a petition to have him sacked. And that's understandable. Now, a friend of mine has some legal experience, and she's laid out her views on this. And I'm just going to paraphrase some of the things she said because I agree with a lot of the points she's making, and there are some aspects of this case that are worth looking at. I will say one thing. At the time, there was a lot of commentary going around. If she was working class male, this wouldn't have happened. I think there's some strong indication that that would be the case. However, it's not strictly true that there haven't been other suspended sentences where the where the defendant, I should say, has has not been from a university educated background. There has been other cases where people have had suspended sentences and they were not privileged students. But I think that is glaring in this case, and I think the reason it's caused public anger is because that was a specific reason that Judge Pringle has laid out. So this is what my friend is discussing and some of the points that she's making. Um, Latest update in the Lavinia Woodward case. 3 complaints made to the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office have been dismissed because they referred to the decision itself. The JCIO deals with the personal conduct of judges only. There is, however, an unduly lenient sentencing scheme in England and Wales. Scotland and Northern Ireland are devolved in this area, where the public can request for certain sentences to be reviewed by the Court of Appeal. But this doesn't apply to unlawful wounding, which is what Woodward was found guilty of. That said, it was still a thoroughly shitty sentence. I agree with that. I did read the Secret Barrister update. The Secret Barrister's legal, as I understand it, a legal website where you can look at the deeper background into some cases. Number one, the impact on the villain must be fully considered, and I don't think it was in this case. I agree with my friend there. The judge barely even mentioned the victim. The fact that he, whilst his injury was not as bad as it could have been, he did suffer depression and, in a sense, post traumatic stress anxiety. The victim's stab wounds to the leg and fingers were treated with stitches and described as relatively minor, but there is no real acknowledgement of the anxiety and depression he suffered. Her heavy alcohol consumption was an aggravating factor in the sentence. Personally, I've never been keen on alcohol being used as an excuse. As far as I'm concerned, free thinking adults choose to get drunk. They're responsible for what follows. So far, straightforward. But the judge then goes on to describe her as old enough and intelligent enough to realize that overindulgence would severely affect your behavior, which then completely contradicts one of the factors given in mitigation, her supposed immaturity. So Judge Pringle is contradicting himself. He states that she has no previous convictions whatsoever. That's true, but it fails to take into account two other allegations of assault against the same ex, which were allowed to lie on her file. How would one establish a pattern when only the most serious charge comes forward? Woodward breached all her bail conditions in order to apologise to her ex, but this doesn't go against her. The judge is convinced that her remorse is genuine. Let's hope that she didn't, in fact, lie to another ex about having cancer. I'm not sure what that's a reference to, but the way I see it, I'll just make a quick point about that. She may be genuinely remorseful. I'm not entirely sure. There have been plenty of examples of violent men who say to their female victims, "Oh, I'm sorry, darling, I'll never do it again. I feel terrible about myself, blah, 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 blah." If we're not going to let those men away with it, and if we, don't give them the benefit of the doubt, why should we believe that Lavinia Woodward wouldn't do this again? Um, I think it's too big a risk. And should I think that it should be a mitigating factor? Maybe to some extent. Certainly, it's different from someone that shows no remorse. But like I say, you get violent men who say they're sorry and then they go on and do it again. I honestly believe she felt she would get away with it because of her gender. That's my own feeling. The judge praises Woodward for addressing her alcohol, cocaine addiction, and borderline personality disorder through rehab and counselling. Alcohol and drug addiction are obviously a serious problem, but again, that's not the victim's fault. I have my own views on that. I believe that people, whilst they are addictions, I think people are responsible for what they do in those circumstances, and I have no sympathy for using violence and then using an addiction as an excuse, because not everyone who has an addiction resorts to violence. Yeah, they don't all resort to violence. But I would like to know how many other defendants in similar circumstances get their sentencing deferred and an opportunity to prove themselves in the first place. That's a good point. Much is made of the fact that Woodward suffered domestic violence in a previous relationship, and would totally understand if she had suffered from battered women syndrome here. I'm not overly familiar with that, so I can't comment in detail. But her relationship with the victim was quite different. Even when he had been stabbed, he was more concerned with getting her to hospital. Incidentally, 46% of women in prison have experienced domestic violence. My own take on that is that even if that had been the case, it's no excuse. As far as I'm concerned, that is a bit like saying, if this was used in mitigation, that's a bit like saying a violent man can say when he was a child his mother abused him. So, let me away with beating up my wife or my girlfriend. If anything, she should have more empathy, um, rather than seemingly taking out her anger problems on her boyfriend. I don't think it's an excuse, and I'm afraid I don't have a great deal of sympathy with that. You know, domestic violence is an awful thing, but it doesn't excuse her taking it out on her boyfriend. And finally, the secret barrister is correct to say that even women without Woodward's glittering prospects would receive a suspended sentence. The same thing happened to a 55-year-old woman in Norfolk who stabbed her partner in the chest. But should they? Last word with Norman Brennan, a former police officer, 31 years experience, who campaigns for victims of crime. I believe he's the president of the Victims of Crime Trust. This is a crime that should always attract a prison sentence. At a time when at a time when knife crime is out of control, the court should be setting an example. What Judge Pringle has said is that because this young woman is smart, she can commit a serious offence, and it's only by luck that his injuries were not more serious than, I don't know why. Maybe because she was in a drunken state, she she grazed him. I don't know, but it was serious enough. Um, I think it's repugnant that the court let her away with this, and the same in other cases. So it may be that the public was somewhat misguided into thinking that this was a totally unique case. But I think the reason it has got attention is precisely because of Judge Pringle's rationale. And I think this judge, the very fact that he went out of his way to praise her, and he couldn't even bring himself to condemn what she had done vocally, I think it's an utter disgrace. What he is doing is setting a dangerous example that if you're smart, you're going to be spared a custodial sentence if you commit a serious crime. That is perverse. It's the survival of the fittest logic. I personally feel he should be struck off. There is a petition to that effect. He is facing an internal investigation, I'm pleased to say. I've long believed that judges escape the same sort of personal scrutiny that politicians do, and I don't see why. They're in a position of power, as politicians are. If a politician puts forward an unpopular policy, they can be voted out of office. There is limited empowerment that the public actually have when it comes to judges they feel are totally incompetent. And a good deal of the public feel this judge was dead wrong. It is good that there's an internal review underway. The system in England and Wales is somewhat different from Scotland. In Scotland, as I understand it, it's even more complex. But I do believe the public should have some empowerment against judges who issue disproportionately lenient sentences. Um, I'm not saying this out of some sort of vendetta against this woman, and to be honest, because of the attention on the case, she's going to find it very difficult to get work. I think the real controversy here is in the attitude of Judge Pringle. Um, That to me is a major issue. So it's been a very revealing case, and I hope other judges who think about passing such an absurd sentence in light of a serious crime will think twice. Judge Pringle deserves the scrutiny that he is under, because this is a dangerous, in my opinion, it is dangerous to say that if you're smart, you're going to escape justice. It's perverse. You could be a rocket scientist, you could come up with a cure for cancer, right? But if you go out and kill 10 people, you've still committed a crime. And where there is a crime, there has to be justice. It's as simple as that. So let me know your thoughts, and that's thank you to my friend for letting me use her talking point specific. That provides a lot of context. Okay, let me know your thoughts, and thank you for watching.